A Maryland cold case from 1970 has finally been solved, and the arrest revelation is shocking the entire community. On October 16th, 16-year-old Pamela Conyers stopped at Harundale Mall in Glen Burnie on her way to homecoming. She never made it home. 4 days later, her strangled body was found in Anne Arundel County woods, launching an investigation that would span 5 decades. For years, her parents, Marie and Lyle Conyers, watched detectives come and go, leads fade to nothing, and hope slip away like smoke. The killer walked free, living quietly among them for decades. Then in 2022, something changed. New detectives turned to cutting-edge genetic genealogy, tracing DNA through family trees until one name emerged from the shadows. Forrest Clyde Williams III. He had died in 2018, never knowing investigators were closing in. But when the truth finally surfaced in September 2023, it left everyone asking the same haunting question: how many other monsters have been hiding in plain sight? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The mall parking lot buzzed with Friday evening energy. Teenagers hurried past store windows, their voices echoing off concrete walls. Pamela Conyers checked her reflection in her car's side mirror one more time, smoothing her dark hair. She had promised her parents she would go straight to the homecoming dance after this quick stop. The car keys felt warm in her palm as she locked the family sedan. She needed to pick up something small from one of the shops, a last-minute touch for tonight. Her friends were already at the school gymnasium, probably wondering where she was. The dance had started 30 minutes ago. Inside Harundale Mall, fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh brightness. Pamela walked quickly past the fountain where other kids gathered, laughing and talking. She waved to a few classmates but didn't stop. She had somewhere to be. "Pam, you're not coming to the dance?" called out Jenny, a girl from her art class. "I'll be there soon," Pamela smiled back. "Save me a dance." The purchase took only a few minutes. Whatever it was, she tucked it carefully into her purse. The autumn air felt crisp as she stepped back outside. Her breath made small clouds in the cold. She slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine hummed to life. She backed out of the parking space and headed toward the mall exit. Her headlights cut through the growing darkness as she turned onto the main road. The dance was only 15 minutes away. She was already imagining the music, the decorations, the faces of friends she hadn't seen all week. Her parents had worried about her driving alone at night, but Glen Burnie felt safe. Everyone knew everyone. She never made it to the school. Somewhere between the mall and her destination, Pamela Conyers vanished into the Maryland night. Her car headlights disappeared down the road, carrying her toward a fate no 16-year-old should face. The next morning, Marie Conyers stood at the kitchen window, still in her housecoat. Pamela's bed hadn't been slept in. The family car was gone. "Maybe she stayed at a friend's house," Lyle said quietly, but his voice carried doubt. Pamela always called. She always came home. By noon, they were at the Glen Burnie police station. The desk sergeant looked up from his paperwork as they approached, taking in Marie's worried expression and Lyle's clenched fists. "Our daughter didn't come home last night," Marie began, her voice steady but tight. "She was supposed to be at the school dance." The sergeant pulled out a missing person report form. The white paper looked so official, so final. "Name? Pamela Conyers. She's 16. When did you last see her?" Marie closed her eyes. "Yesterday around 6. She took the car to the mall, then was going to homecoming." The questions continued. Height, weight, what she was wearing, who her friends were. Each answer felt like a small betrayal, turning their daughter into a list of facts and descriptions. "Has she ever run away before?" "Never," Lyle said firmly. "Something's wrong." The sergeant's expression softened. He had teenage daughters too. "We'll put out an alert for the vehicle." "License plate?" Lyle recited the numbers he knew by heart. The same numbers he had taught Pamela to memorize in case of emergency. They drove the route from the mall to the school twice, then 3 times. No sign of the sedan. No sign of their girl. Word spread through their neighborhood like ripples in still water. By evening, friends and neighbors gathered in the Conyers' living room. Marie made coffee with shaking hands. The missing person report lay folded on the kitchen counter, a piece of paper that had somehow become the most important document in their lives. Mrs. Henderson from next door squeezed Marie's shoulder. "She'll come home, honey. Kids her age, they sometimes just..." But the words trailed off. Everyone knew Pamela wasn't the type to just disappear. Dawn brought no comfort. Pamela had been missing for over 36 hours. The fear that had crept through Glen Burnie the night before now settled like a heavy blanket over the entire community. Students at her high school whispered in hallways between classes. Teachers struggled to maintain normal lessons when desks sat empty and minds wandered to dark possibilities. "Has anyone heard anything?" asked Sarah, Pamela's locker neighbor. "My dad's helping with the search," replied Mike, whose father worked at the fire department. "They're checking every road between here and the mall." Principal Morrison made an announcement over the intercom. "For those asking about Pamela Conyers, please keep her and her family in your thoughts and prayers. If anyone has information about her whereabouts on Friday evening, please see me immediately. After school, dozens of students and parents gathered at the mall parking lot. Someone had brought a box of hand-drawn missing person flyers. The papers felt flimsy, inadequate, but they were action when helplessness felt unbearable. Marie Conyers stood beside the fountain where Pamela had waved to her friend just 2 nights ago. "She's about my height," she told volunteers. "Brown hair, brown eyes." She was wearing her blue dress, the one with the small flowers. They spread out across the mall, taping flyers to windows, handing them to shoppers, asking the same questions over and over. "Have you seen this girl? Do you remember seeing her Friday night?" Store managers unlocked security offices. Employees squinted at grainy photographs from surveillance cameras. The images showed crowds of people, but in the black and white footage, every teenage girl looked the same. Lyle coordinated search teams from his truck in the parking lot. Groups of volunteers took different sections, the roads leading north toward Baltimore, the suburban neighborhoods to the west, the rural areas to the south where farmland met forest. As the sun set on Sunday evening, exhaustion weighed on everyone. They had covered hundreds of miles, knocked on countless doors, asked thousands of questions. "We'll find her," whispered Jenny from art class, but her voice shook. "We have to find her." Tuesday morning brought the discovery everyone had hoped never to make. A driver taking a shortcut through the rural roads of Anne Arundel County spotted something that didn't belong. Pamela's car sat abandoned on a narrow gravel road, 15 miles from where she was last seen alive. The sedan looked almost peaceful, parked beneath tall oak trees, just beginning to turn autumn colors. Detective Ray Hutchinson arrived at the scene within an hour. The vehicle evidence tag fluttered in the breeze as he circled the car, noting everything. Driver's door unlocked, keys missing, no signs of struggle inside the passenger compartment. "Purse is still here," called Officer Davis from the passenger side. "Wallet's intact, still has money." This wasn't a robbery. Detective Hutchinson had worked enough cases to know the signs. Something worse had happened here. The car had been dusted for fingerprints, photographed from every angle, searched for any trace of what had occurred. But the gray Maryland sky offered no answers, only the terrible confirmation that Pamela Conyers had not driven herself to this lonely stretch of road. Marie and Lyle stood at the police station, holding each other as Detective Hutchinson explained what they had found. The words seemed to echo in the small room. "Abandoned vehicle, no signs of the driver, investigation ongoing." "What does this mean?" Marie asked, though she already knew. "It means we treat this as more than a missing person case," the detective replied gently. "We're organizing search teams to cover the area around where the car was found." Volunteers arrived throughout the afternoon. Neighbors, classmates, strangers who had seen the flyers and felt compelled to help. They formed lines and walked through fields, peered into drainage ditches, pushed through underbrush calling Pamela's name. The yellow evidence tape around the abandoned car fluttered in the cold October wind, marking the spot where hope had officially died. No parent should have to see their child's car surrounded by police tape, but the Conyers family had no choice. They stood and watched as their worst fears began taking shape. Wednesday dawned gray and drizzling, as if the sky mourned with them. The search teams had been combing the woods near the abandoned car since first light. Detective Hutchinson led one group through a section of dense forest about half a mile from the road. Fallen leaves made everything slippery. Every shape could be something significant. Every shadow might hide what they dreaded to find. "Over here!" The shout came from Officer Martinez, about 50 yards to the west. The crime scene. Photography began immediately, each angle captured carefully, documenting what no family should ever have to know about their child's final moments. The evidence would be crucial, though no one could imagine it would take 53 years to matter. Detective Hutchinson knelt beside the scene, his trained eyes taking in details. "Strangulation," he noted quietly to the medical examiner. "No signs of sexual assault, but they would need the full autopsy to be certain." The radio crackled. "Detective, the family is asking for updates. How do you tell parents that their 16-year-old daughter is never coming home? How do you explain that their bright, kind child had met a monster in the Maryland woods?" "I'll speak with them personally," Hutchinson replied. Back at the Conyers house, neighbors had been bringing food all morning. Casseroles and sandwiches covered every surface in the kitchen, but no one felt like eating. Marie sat at the kitchen table, still in the same clothes she had worn to bed, staring at nothing. The doorbell rang. Lyle opened it to find Detective Hutchinson on their front porch, his expression saying everything before he spoke a word. "Mr. and Mrs. Conyers, I need to speak with you." They sat in the living room, surrounded by the concerned faces of family and friends. The detective chose his words carefully, but there was no gentle way to destroy a family's world. "We found Pamela this morning." Marie's sob cut through the quiet house like broken glass. Lyle's knees buckled, and he collapsed onto their front lawn, grief overwhelming his body completely. Neighbors rushed to help, but there was no comfort for this pain. Their beautiful daughter was gone, taken by someone who had left her in the cold woods like she meant nothing. By evening, news vans lined the street outside the Conyers' home. The story had spread beyond Glen Burnie, beyond Maryland. A teenage girl murdered on her way to homecoming. Every parent's nightmare made real. Glen Burnie High School held an emergency assembly. Principal Morrison stood before hundreds of students, many of them crying, all of them shocked by how quickly their safe world had cracked open. Pamela Conyers was one of our own, he began, his voice heavy with grief. She was kind, intelligent, and had her whole life ahead of her. Today we mourn not just her death, but the loss of innocence in our community. The school counselors set up in every classroom. Teachers abandoned lesson plans to let students talk, cry, and try to make sense of the senseless. In the parking lot of Harundale Mall, someone had set up a makeshift memorial. Flowers, candles, and handwritten notes covered a small table. "We love you, Pamela. You didn't deserve this. We will never forget." Detective Hutchinson worked late into the night, organizing the growing case file. Witness statements, evidence logs, photographs, the initial forensics reports. Everything pointed to a stranger abduction, but who and why Pamela? The investigation would require canvassing every business along her route, interviewing every person who had been at the mall that Friday, tracking down every lead, no matter how remote. As darkness fell over Glen Burnie, hundreds of people gathered at the high school football field for a candlelight vigil. The small flames flickered against the black sky, creating a galaxy of grief and solidarity. Marie Conyers stood at the center of it all, accepting hugs from classmates and neighbors, listening to stories about her daughter's kindness and humor. But her eyes remained empty, focused on something no one else could see. She was going to be an artist, Marie whispered to no one in particular. She drew the most beautiful pictures. The candles burned down to nothing, but the community stayed long after the flames had died. No one wanted to leave, to return to a world where 16-year-old girls could simply disappear forever. November brought the first snow and the crushing reality. Pamela's killer remained free. Detective Hutchinson's desk grew heavy with case files, witness statements, and evidence reports that led nowhere. They had questioned everyone who worked at the mall that Friday night. Store clerks, security guards, maintenance workers, other teenagers who had been there around the same time. Everyone remembered seeing lots of kids, but specific memories were vague. The forensic evidence offered some hope. Partial fingerprints that didn't match anyone in the family. DNA material that couldn't yet be processed. The technology didn't exist yet. Fibers from clothing that didn't belong to the victim. "We're missing something," Hutchinson muttered to his partner, Detective Coleman. "Someone saw something. Someone knows something." They had received dozens of tips. Anonymous calls reporting suspicious men, strange cars, unusual behavior. Each lead required hours of investigation, and each one ended in disappointment. The Conyers family offered a reward, $5,000 for information leading to an arrest. The money sat untouched as weeks passed without progress. Lyle quit his job at the mechanic shop to focus entirely on finding his daughter's killer. He spent his days driving the rural roads where she had died, looking for anything the police might have missed. He knocked on doors, asked questions, made himself a familiar figure to everyone who lived in Anne Arundel County. "My daughter was murdered," he would say to strangers. "Have you seen anything unusual? Anyone who seemed out of place?" The neighbors were kind but helpless. It was hunting season, they said. Lots of men in the woods, lots of unfamiliar trucks on the back roads, nothing that seemed especially suspicious at the time. By December, the case files filled 2 boxes. Detective Hutchinson stared at them with growing frustration. Somewhere in those pages was the key to finding Pamela's killer. But where? The trail was growing cold. Witnesses forgot details. Physical evidence remained limited. The killer had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. Years passed, like water through cupped hands. Detective Hutchinson retired in 1978, his final case report noting that all leads had been exhausted. The evidence boxes were transferred to storage, along with thousands of other unsolved cases. Pamela's yearbook photo faded on the mantle at her parents' home. The girl who loved art and had dreams of college became a memory preserved in black and white. Marie kept her daughter's bedroom exactly as it had been, down to the art supplies on the desk and the homecoming dress hanging in the closet. New detectives occasionally reviewed the file. They asked the same questions, followed the same cold leads, and reached the same frustrating conclusions. Without better forensic technology, the case remained frozen in time. The Conyers family aged under the weight of unanswered questions. Marie's hair went gray, then white. Lyle's hands grew shaky, but he still drove the rural roads every October 20th, marking the anniversary of finding Pamela's car. "Someone knows," he would tell Marie every year. "Someone out there knows who did this to our girl." The community slowly healed around the wound. New families moved into Glen Burnie. Young people who had never heard of Pamela Conyers graduated from the high school. The memorial table at the mall was removed during a renovation. But for those who remembered, October brought the same ache every year. Teachers who had known her would pause at empty desks. Classmates, now adults with children of their own, would light candles on the anniversary. The evidence boxes sat in storage, accumulating dust and bureaucratic tags. Case number 70 to 4821. Priority, cold. Status, unsolved. In one box sat the piece of evidence that would eventually solve the case, a small sample of DNA material carefully preserved but not yet processable. The killer's genetic signature waited patiently for technology to catch up to justice. Pamela's photograph looked out from the case file, 17 forever, her eyes bright with a future that had been stolen. Somewhere, her killer was living a normal life, unaware that science would eventually point an accusing finger across the decades. The 1980s brought new hope in the form of Detective Sarah Mackenzie, fresh from the police academy and assigned to the cold case division. She opened the dusty boxes of evidence with reverence, knowing she was touching the remnants of someone's shattered life. The transferred case files told the story of a thorough but ultimately fruitless investigation. Every witness statement had been followed up, every lead had been pursued to its disappointing end. But Mackenzie noticed something others had missed. "Look at this," she said to her supervisor, holding up a witness statement from 1970. "Mrs. Patterson says she saw a man near the abandoned car area 2 days before the body was found. Dark hair, medium build, driving a pickup truck. That was investigated," her supervisor replied. "They never found the truck, but they never cross-referenced it with this statement from the mall security guard," Mackenzie continued. "He mentions a man asking about store closing times, said he seemed nervous. It was thin, but it was something." Mackenzie spent weeks tracking down Mrs. Patterson, now in her 70s and living in Florida. "I remember that day clear as anything," the elderly woman said over the phone. "He was just standing there by the road, like he was waiting for something. When I drove past later, he was gone." The description was vague. Most men in 1970 had dark hair and medium builds. The pickup truck could have been any of thousands in Maryland, but Mackenzie felt the familiar tingle of a detective who had found a real lead. DNA testing was still in its infancy, available only for the most serious cases. The evidence from Pamela's murder qualified, but the results were limited. They could confirm that genetic material had been left by someone other than the victim, but couldn't identify whose. Mackenzie filed her report with cautious optimism. The case remained unsolved, but for the first time in over a decade, new information had been added to the file. She visited the Conyers family personally, explaining the modest progress. "It's something," Marie said quietly, gripping her husband's hand. "After all these years, it's something." The 1990s brought profound changes to the Conyers family. Lyle's health began to fail, the years of grief and obsessive searching taking their toll on his heart. He spent more time in hospitals than at home, and Marie found herself caring for him while still carrying the weight of Pamela's unsolved murder. Their daughter's bedroom became Marie's refuge. She would sit at Pamela's desk, running her fingers over the art supplies that had remained untouched for 20 years. The sketches and paintings Pamela had created in high school still covered the walls, portraits of friends, landscapes of Maryland countryside, abstract designs that revealed a creative mind cut short. "She would have been 40 years old this year," Marie whispered to her husband during one of his hospital stays. "She might have had children by now. We might have been grandparents." Lyle squeezed her hand weakly. "She's still with us, Marie. She'll always be with us." Detective Mackenzie had moved on to other cases, but she made sure to update the Conyers family whenever technology offered new possibilities. Partial DNA profiles could now be extracted from smaller samples. Computer databases were beginning to link cases across state lines. "We're not giving up," she assured Marie during their annual phone call. "Science keeps improving. Someday we'll have the tools to solve this." Marie kept boxes of newspaper clippings about advances in forensic science, hoping each breakthrough might be the one that finally pointed to her daughter's killer. She read about DNA convictions in other cold cases, families finally getting answers after decades of waiting, but the call never came. The evidence from Pamela's case remained scientifically useful but not specific enough to identify a suspect. The killer's genetic signature existed in the system, but without a match in the database, it was just meaningless letters and numbers. In the attic, boxes of Pamela's belongings sat alongside the Christmas decorations and old family photos. Every year, Marie would climb the narrow stairs and touch the cardboard containers that held her daughter's entire earthly existence. Clothes, books, jewelry, letters from friends, all the pieces of a life interrupted. The dawn of the 21st century brought revolutionary changes to forensic science. DNA testing became more sophisticated, able to extract profiles from increasingly degraded samples. Computer databases expanded, linking cases across continents. Detective James Morrison, no relation to the old high school principal, took over the cold case division in 2001. He was young, ambitious, and fascinated by the intersection of technology and justice. "This Conyers case," he said to his partner, reading through the file. "The evidence samples are still viable. We could run them through the new CODIS database." The early DNA test results from the 1990s were inconclusive, but the technology had improved dramatically. Fresh samples were extracted from the carefully preserved evidence and processed through the most advanced equipment available. The results came back with disappointing news. Yes, they had a complete DNA profile of the killer. No, there was no match in any database. The person who had murdered Pamela Conyers had never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require DNA sampling. Detective Morrison personally delivered the news to Marie Conyers, now a widow of 3 years. She sat in her living room, surrounded by 50 years of accumulated grief, and listened as he explained that they knew exactly who had killed her daughter. They just didn't know who that person was. "It's like having a key but no lock," she said quietly. "Or maybe having a lock but no idea where the door island." The case remained open, but active investigation essentially stopped. With no new leads and no matches in the system, there was nothing left to do but wait. Wait for the killer to commit another crime. Wait for technology to advance further. Wait for a miracle. Public interest in the case had long since faded. New tragedies captured attention. Fresh mysteries demanded resources. Pamela Conyers became a statistic in the growing number of cold cases that might never be solved. Morrison closed the evidence box with a heavy sigh, knowing he had failed another family who deserved justice. The DNA profile went into the computer system, where it would automatically be checked against new entries. Perhaps someday, somehow, it would find its match. Detective Marcus Williams joined the Anne Arundel County Police Department's cold case unit in 2010, bringing fresh eyes and a personal connection to unsolved crimes. His own sister had been murdered in Baltimore 15 years earlier, and her case remained open. On his first day, he found himself drawn to a particular file box marked Conyers, Pamela, 1970. The case photo showed a girl around his sister's age, bright-eyed and full of promise. Something about her smile reminded him of his own family's loss. Williams took the photograph back to his desk and slid it into his wallet, next to his badge. It became his personal reminder that every cold case represented someone's daughter, sister, friend, someone whose family still waited for answers. "Tell me about the Conyers case," he asked Detective Morrison. 40 years old this October. Good evidence. Complete DNA profile. No matches. The family's been incredibly patient, but they're aging. The mother's in her 80s now. Williams visited Marie Conyers at home, finding her smaller and frailer than he had expected, but with eyes still sharp with determination. "I know what you're going to say," she began before he could speak. "The case is cold. No new leads. Technology might help someday. I've heard it all before." "Actually," Williams said gently, "I wanted to tell you that I'm not giving up. I've read every page of your daughter's file. I've studied the evidence. And I believe that someday, somehow, we'll find who did this to Pamela." Marie studied his face carefully. "You really mean that?" "Yes, ma'am, I do." Williams began reviewing the case regularly, looking for connections to other crimes, searching for patterns they might have missed. He attended conferences on cold case investigation, learned about new techniques, and networked with detectives across the country. The photograph in his wallet became worn from handling. Pamela's face watched him work late nights and early mornings, a constant reminder of his promise to her mother. He had no idea that the answer was already written in the DNA database, waiting for technology to catch up to justice. In the spring of 2018, Forrest Clyde Williams III died quietly in his sleep at the age of 76. He had lived an unremarkable life in Maryland, working various manual labor jobs, never marrying, keeping mostly to himself. His neighbors remembered him as polite but distant. He would wave hello but rarely stop to chat. He kept his small house neat and his yard tidy. Nothing about him suggested he was carrying a terrible secret. Williams had no family to speak of, few friends, and fewer possessions. When he died, the state handled his affairs. His death certificate was filed with the usual bureaucratic efficiency, noting cause of death as natural causes. No one connected Forrest Williams to a 16-year-old girl who had been murdered 48 years earlier. No one had any reason to make that connection. He had never been a suspect, never been questioned, never appeared in any of the case files. But his death removed the final barrier to justice. While he lived, the truth remained hidden in his genes. Now that he was gone, science would eventually point an accusing finger at his memory. Across the country, cold case detectives were beginning to experiment with a new investigative tool, forensic genetic genealogy. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA had created massive databases of genetic information from people curious about their family histories. Investigators realized they could use these databases to solve crimes. By uploading DNA profiles from crime scenes, they could identify distant relatives of perpetrators. Then, working backward through family trees, they could narrow down suspects until they found their target. The technique had already solved several high-profile cases. The Golden State Killer, who had terrorized California for decades, was identified through genetic genealogy in 2018. Other cold cases were falling like dominoes as investigators applied the new method. Meanwhile, in Maryland, Detective Williams continued his regular review of the Conyers case, unaware that the killer's death had just made justice possible. The DNA profile that had sat in the database for years, uselessly perfect, was about to become the key that would finally unlock 50 years of mystery. By 2022, the Anne Arundel County Police Department had secured funding to apply forensic genetic genealogy to their oldest cold cases. Detective Williams, now the senior investigator in the unit, chose the Conyers case as their first priority. "We have excellent DNA evidence," he explained to the genetic genealogy consultant they had hired. "Complete profile, well-preserved samples. If this technique can solve any case, it can solve this one." The consultant, Dr. Sarah Chen, had worked on dozens of cold cases across the country. She uploaded Pamela's killer's DNA profile to several genealogy databases and began the painstaking work of building family trees. "This could take months," she warned. "We're looking for distant cousins, people who share great-great-grandparents with our subject. Then we work forward through generations until we find someone who fits the profile." Detective Williams signed the genetic genealogy contract with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred documents. After 12 years of carrying Pamela's photograph in his wallet, he finally had a real chance to solve her case. Marie Conyers was now 87 years old, living in the same house where she had waited for her daughter to come home in 1970. Detective Williams visited her regularly, updating her on the new investigation. "Genetic genealogy," she repeated slowly. "They use DNA to find family members?" "That's right. Even if the killer never committed another crime, we can find him through his relatives. It's like following branches on a family tree until we reach the person we're looking for." Marie nodded thoughtfully. Pamela would have loved this. She always liked puzzles, figuring out how things connected to each other. The work progressed slowly but steadily. Dr. Chen identified several potential relatives, then began the careful process of researching their family histories. Birth certificates, marriage records, census data, obituaries, all the paper trails that people leave behind as they live their lives. "We're getting close," she reported after 3 months of work. "I've narrowed it down to 3 families in the Maryland area. Now we need to look at which men from these families would have been the right age in 1970. Detective Williams felt the familiar excitement of a case about to break open. After 52 years, Pamela's killer was finally about to be identified. Early 2023 brought the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Dr. Chen's family tree research had identified a cluster of relatives in Maryland, and one name kept appearing in the records: Williams. Forrest Clyde Williams III, she announced during a meeting at the police station. Born in 1942, died in 2018. He fits the age profile perfectly, would have been 28 when Pamela was killed. Detective Williams stared at the family tree diagram spread across the conference table. Lines connected dozens of names, creating a web that stretched back generations. At the center of it all was a man who had lived quietly in Maryland for his entire life. "What do we know about him?" Detective Williams asked. "Not much yet. He worked construction and landscaping jobs, never married, no children, lived alone in a small house about 30 miles from where Pamela's body was found." The coincidence was striking, but they needed more than geographic proximity. They needed direct DNA confirmation. It took weeks to locate samples of Williams' DNA. He had never been arrested, so there was no profile in the criminal database. But he had been in the hospital several times in his final years, and medical records showed blood samples had been stored for routine testing. "We need a court order to access those samples," the district attorney explained, "and we need to be absolutely certain before we make any public announcements." The wait was excruciating. Detective Williams called Marie Conyers weekly, updating her on their progress while trying to manage her expectations. "We think we know who did it," he told her carefully, "but we need to be absolutely sure before we say anything official." Marie sat in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she had waited for news in 1970. "Is he still alive?" "No, ma'am. He died a few years ago," she nodded slowly. "I always wondered if I might have met him somewhere. In the grocery store, at church, walking past him on the street. All these years, wondering if I was looking into the eyes of my daughter's killer and not knowing it." The court order was approved in March. The DNA samples were tested and retested. The results came back with scientific certainty. Forrest Clyde Williams III was the man who had murdered Pamela Conyers. The confirmation came on a Wednesday afternoon in late spring. Detective Williams sat in his office, holding the DNA match report that finally gave a name to 53 years of mystery. "We found him," he whispered to Pamela's photograph, still carried in his wallet after all these years. The forensic report was definitive. The DNA profile from the crime scene matched Forrest Clyde Williams III with overwhelming statistical certainty. After decades of waiting, science had finally delivered justice. Detective Williams drove directly to Marie Conyers' house. At 87, she moved slowly but still answered the door herself. She took one look at his expression and knew. "You found him." "Yes, ma'am, we found him." They sat in her living room, surrounded by 53 years of accumulated memories. Pamela's artwork still covered the walls. Her bedroom remained unchanged upstairs. The evidence of a life interrupted was everywhere. "Tell me about him," Marie said quietly. Williams explained what they had learned. A man who had lived an ordinary life while carrying an extraordinary secret. A killer who had gone to his grave thinking he had gotten away with murder. Forrest Clyde Williams III. He would have been 28 when he killed Pamela. He lived about 30 miles from where we found her body. He worked construction and odd jobs, never married, kept to himself. Marie listened without interruption, her hands folded in her lap. When Williams finished, she was quiet for a long time. "All these years," she finally said, "I imagined what I would feel when this day came. I thought I'd be angry, or relieved, or happy that we finally had answers." She paused, looking out the window at the street where Pamela had played as a child. "But mostly I just feel tired. Tired and sad that it took so long. Tired that Lyle never lived to see this day. Tired that this man got to live his whole life while our daughter never got the chance to live hers." The lead detective who had made the promise to never give up was now ready to make another one. "We're going to announce this publicly," he told her. "The whole community is going to know that Pamela's case is finally solved." September 2023 brought unseasonably warm weather to Maryland. Inside the Anne Arundel County Police Headquarters, reporters filled every seat in the small conference room. Cameras focused on the podium where Detective Williams stood with the state's attorney. "After 53 years, I can announce that the murder of Pamela Conyers has been solved," Williams began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Ann Colt-Latis, the Anne Arundel County State's attorney, stepped to the microphone. "Through the use of forensic genetic genealogy, we have identified Forrest Clyde Williams III as the person responsible for Pamela's death in 1970. The press conference podium became a symbol of long-delayed justice, the official platform where truth was finally declared after more than 5 decades of waiting. "Williams died in 2018, so there will be no trial," Latis continued. "But we can say with scientific certainty that he was responsible for this heinous crime." Marie Conyers sat in the front row, flanked by surviving relatives and Detective Williams. Her weathered hands gripped a tissue as she listened to the official confirmation of what she had waited her entire adult life to hear. A reporter raised her hand. "Mrs. Conyers, how does it feel to finally have answers?" Marie slowly stood, accepting the microphone from Detective Williams. Her voice, though frail with age, carried the strength of a mother who had never stopped fighting for her daughter. "I'm grateful to everyone who never gave up on Pamela," she said. "Detective Williams, Dr. Chen, all the people who worked on this case over the years, they kept their promise to find the truth." She paused, gathering her thoughts. Pamela was a beautiful girl with her whole life ahead of her. She was kind and talented and loved by everyone who knew her. Nothing can bring her back, but at least now the world knows she didn't die forgotten. The cameras clicked and whirred as Marie returned to her seat. Outside the police station, news vans prepared reports that would carry Pamela's story across the country. A story of persistence, science, and justice finally served. The news spread through Maryland like wildfire. Local television stations led with the story. Newspapers printed special editions. Social media buzzed with reactions from people who remembered the original case. At Glen Burnie High School, now filled with students who hadn't been born when Pamela was killed, teachers used the moment as a lesson about persistence and the advancement of science. The school's memorial wall, installed during a renovation in the 1990s, bore Pamela's name among other students lost too young. Former classmates, now grandparents themselves, called each other with the news. Jenny from art class, the one who had helped distribute flyers in 1970, cried on television as she remembered her friend. "She was just a girl," Jenny said, her voice breaking. "She was just a sweet 16-year-old girl who wanted to go to a dance. She didn't deserve what happened to her." In the days following the announcement, reporters tracked down people who had known Williams. Neighbors described him as quiet, unremarkable, someone who kept to himself but wasn't particularly memorable. "He lived on my street for 20 years, said one elderly woman. "We'd wave hello, but I don't think I ever had a real conversation with him. He just seemed like a regular guy." The revelation that a killer had lived among them for decades sent ripples through the community. How many times had people unknowingly encountered him at the grocery store, the gas station, walking down the sidewalk? How many casual interactions had occurred with someone who had taken a young girl's life and hidden that fact for nearly 50 years? The local newspaper ran headlines that captured the community's complex emotions. "Justice at last for Pamela Conyers. DNA solves 5 3-year-old murder. Local man identified as killer in 1970 case." Detective Williams found himself fielding calls from other law enforcement agencies interested in applying genetic genealogy to their cold cases. Pamela's case had become a template for how modern science could deliver justice even across decades. But for Marie Conyers, the media attention was secondary to the simple relief of finally knowing the truth about her daughter's death. As autumn arrived in 2023, Detective Williams reflected on the decades that had passed between Pamela's murder and its solution. He visited retired investigators who had worked the case, sharing the news that their careful evidence preservation had finally paid off. Detective Ray Hutchinson, the original lead investigator, was now 91 years old and living in a nursing home. Williams found him in the facility's common room, still sharp despite his advanced age. "Forrest Williams," Hutchinson repeated slowly when Williams shared the news. "I don't think we ever looked at him. He wasn't on our radar at all. He had no criminal record, no connection to the victim that we could find. He was just a stranger who crossed her path at the worst possible moment." Hutchinson nodded thoughtfully. "That was always the hardest type of case to solve. Random crime, no obvious motive, no connection between victim and perpetrator. In 1970, we didn't have the tools to catch someone like that." Williams handed the elderly detective a copy of the case closure report. "Your work made this possible. The evidence you collected, the way you preserved it, that's what led us to the killer." The old detective smiled, his eyes bright with satisfaction. "I always told myself that someday we'd solve it. I just never thought it would take 53 years. Other retired investigators expressed similar emotions when Williams contacted them. Detective McKenzie from the 1980s, Detective Morrison from the early 2000s, all of them had carried Pamela's case in their hearts long after they moved on to other assignments. "She became part of all of us," McKenzie said during a phone call. "You can't work a case like that and not be changed by it. I'm just glad that someone finally got the answers her family deserved." Williams visited Pamela's grave for the first time since solving the case. The headstone, weathered by decades of Maryland seasons, bore simple words: "Pamela Conyers, beloved daughter, 1954-1970. He knelt beside the grave and pulled her photograph from his wallet one last time. "We kept our promise, Pamela. We found him." Marie Conyers stood in Pamela's bedroom for what she knew might be the last time. At 87, with her health declining, she had decided it was time to let go of the shrine she had maintained for 53 years. The white rose bouquet from Pamela's grave sat on the desk, still fresh from her most recent visit. She had placed the flowers there after the case was solved, a symbolic gesture of closure after decades of waiting. "I kept everything exactly the same," she explained to her niece, who had come to help with the difficult task of packing up the room. "I thought maybe if I changed anything, she wouldn't be able to find her way home." The clothing in the closet, the art supplies on the desk, the school books on the shelves, all of it had been preserved like artifacts in a museum dedicated to a life cut short. But now, with the killer finally identified, Marie felt ready to let her daughter rest. They worked slowly, carefully wrapping Pamela's artwork and placing it in special boxes. The portraits of friends, the landscapes of Maryland countryside, the abstract pieces that showed such promise, all evidence of a talent that would never reach its full potential. "She was going to study art in college," Marie said, holding a sketch of the family cat. "She had such a gift. She could capture the personality of her subjects, make them come alive on paper." Some items would go to the Anne Arundel County Historical Society, which had requested materials for an exhibit about the case. Others would be kept by family members who wanted to remember the girl they had loved. As they packed, Marie shared stories she had never told anyone. Pamela's first attempts at painting, the way she would sit by the window for hours, sketching birds in the backyard, her excitement about homecoming, the dress she had chosen, the friends she was supposed to meet. "I used to blame myself for letting her go out that night," Marie admitted. "But I know now that what happened to her wasn't my fault. It was his fault, the man who chose to hurt her." The public debate that followed the case announcement reflected the complicated nature of justice in the 21st century. Editorial newspapers across Maryland wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. Justice at last? Read one headline: the question mark capturing the ambiguity of a case solved too late for traditional legal resolution. Some argued that true justice required a trial, a jury verdict, and the possibility of punishment. Without a living suspect to face charges, they said, the case remained incomplete despite the scientific certainty of Williams' guilt. Others countered that justice took many forms. For Pamela's family, knowing the truth was itself a form of resolution. For the community, understanding that the killer was dead brought a sense of safety and closure. Anne Arundel, the Anne Arundel County State's attorney, found herself explaining the legal limitations of posthumous case resolution at community meetings and press conferences. While we cannot prosecute a dead person, we can officially close the case, she explained. The evidence is overwhelming. If Forrest Williams were alive today, he would be charged with first-degree murder. The discussion extended beyond Maryland. True crime podcasts dedicated episodes to the case. Legal experts debated the implications of solving crimes decades after both victim and perpetrator had died. Ethicists questioned the use of consumer DNA databases for law enforcement purposes. For Detective Williams, the philosophical debates mattered less than the practical result. A family had answers, a community had closure. The tools of modern science had reached across 53 years to deliver truth. Justice isn't always about courtrooms and prison sentences, he said in an interview with the Baltimore Sunday. Sometimes justice is about refusing to let someone be forgotten. It's about keeping promises to families who deserve answers. The editorial debates would continue, but for those who had lived with the mystery of Pamela's murder for half a century, the discussion was largely academic. They had what they needed, the truth. October 2023 marked 53 years since Pamela Conyers had driven to Harundale Mall on what should have been an ordinary Friday night. The anniversary took on new meaning now that her killer had been identified. Marie Conyers, supported by family members and Detective Williams, made her way to the site where the old mall had once stood. The building had been torn down years earlier, replaced by a shopping center with different stores and a different energy, but the fountain where Pamela had waved goodbye to her friends still stood, preserved as part of the new development. Someone had placed memorial candles around its base, creating a circle of flickering light against the autumn darkness. People came throughout the evening. Former classmates, now elderly themselves, neighbors who remembered the search parties, strangers who had followed the case in the news. They stood quietly, sharing memories of a girl most had never known personally, but who had touched their lives through her tragic death. She would have been 69 years old, Marie said to the gathering. She would have had children, maybe grandchildren. She would have been an artist, I think. She had such talent. A local reporter asked if Marie felt peace now that the case was solved. Peace might be too strong a word, she replied thoughtfully, but I feel complete. For 53 years, there was this hole in our family's story. We knew how it began, but we didn't know how it ended. Now we do. The memorial candles burned down slowly as the night deepened. One by one, people drifted away, returning to lives that had been touched, however briefly, by Pamela's story. Detective Williams was among the last to leave. He had solved the case that had defined his career, but he knew that Pamela's memory would stay with him forever. The candles flickered against the October wind, small flames of remembrance in the darkness where a young girl had once laughed with her friends, unaware that she was living her final hours. The success of Pamela's case sparked renewed interest in cold case investigations across Maryland and beyond. Police departments began allocating resources to genetic genealogy programs, hoping to solve other decades-old murders. Detective Williams found himself consulting on similar cases, sharing the techniques that had finally identified Forrest Williams. The methodology was becoming standardized, turning what had once seemed like detective work into a more scientific process. Pamela's case proved that no case is ever truly cold, Williams explained to a gathering of law enforcement officials. As long as we have viable DNA evidence, we have hope of solving even the oldest crimes. In Anne Arundel County, investigators reopened several forgotten case files. The box of evidence that had sat next to Pamela's for 30 years contained samples from a 1985 murder that had never been solved. A 1992 rape case yielded DNA that could now be processed through genetic genealogy. Each reopened case represented another family that had waited for answers, another victim whose death had gone unavenged. The tools that had solved Pamela's murder offered hope to dozens of other families. Marie Conyers received letters from relatives of other victims, thanking her for never giving up on her daughter's case. Her persistence had helped develop the methods that might solve their cases too. Your daughter's story gives us hope, wrote the mother of a girl killed in 1987. If they could find her killer after 53 years, maybe they can find ours too. The ripple effects extended far beyond Maryland. Police departments in other states contacted Detective Williams for guidance on implementing genetic genealogy programs. The techniques that had identified Forrest Williams became a template for law enforcement agencies across the country. Scientific journals published papers analyzing the methodology. Law schools added genetic genealogy to their curricula. The intersection of consumer DNA testing and criminal investigation became a new frontier in forensic science. But for all the academic and professional interest, the real impact remained personal. Families getting answers, communities finding closure, victims finally getting justice. Spring 2024 brought the final chapter of Pamela's story. The Anne Arundel County Memorial Wall, which had borne her name since 1990s, received a new addition during a community ceremony. The bronze plaque read simply, Pamela Conyers, 1950–1970, beloved daughter, talented artist, and symbol of justice that never gives up. Marie Conyers, now 88, and moving with the help of a walker, pressed her hand against her daughter's name on the memorial wall. The metal felt warm from the morning Sunday. She's not forgotten, Marie whispered. She'll never be forgotten. Detective Williams stood beside her, still carrying Pamela's photograph in his wallet, though the case was officially closed. Solving her murder had been the defining achievement of his career, but it had also changed him in ways he was still discovering. What will you do now? Marie asked him as they stood before the memorial. Keep working, he replied. There are other families waiting for answers, other victims whose stories need to be told. The ceremony was small, attended by family members, retired investigators, and a handful of community members who had never forgotten the 16-year-old girl who had disappeared in 1970. No cameras, no media attention, just a quiet recognition of a life that had mattered. As the sun climbed higher in the Maryland sky, casting long shadows across the memorial wall, Marie Conyers felt something she hadn't experienced in 54 years. The sense that her daughter's story was complete. The investigation was over. The killer had been identified. The community had closure. The memorial wall would ensure that future generations would remember Pamela's name and story. Dawn light spilled across Pamela's photograph in Detective Williams' wallet as he walked back to his car, ready to begin work on the next cold case. The next family waiting for answers, the next chance to prove that justice, however delayed, would eventually find its way home. The scar would always remain, but now it carried light as well as shadow, the light of truth finally revealed, of promises kept, and of a love that had refused to let go.